That's it, Mr. Thorne. I've had it with your little bug hotel and your blatant disregard for community standards. You have 48 hours to dismantle that insect-infested monstrosity, or my contractor will do it for you, and you'll be billed for the demolition, the disposal, the pesticide treatment, and a $10,000 non-compliance fine. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association, stood on my lawn like a bulldog guarding a bone, her floral print muumuu a garish splash of color against the manicured green. Her clipboard was held like a scepter, a symbol of her imagined dominion, and behind her a beefy man in a stained work shirt leaned against a pickup truck, arms crossed, a sledgehammer glinting ominously in the bed. Her voice, a shrill instrument honed by years of berating retail workers and terrorizing neighbors, cut through the peaceful Saturday morning air. I had just finished my coffee, the steam still rising from the mug in my hand, and was admiring the very structure she was condemning. It wasn't a bug hotel. It was a scientifically designed solitary bee habitat, a project I was deeply proud of, and more importantly, one that was part of a registered research program with the state university. But to Karen, it was just another nail to be hammered down. Her eyes, small and hard, swept over my property, cataloging every perceived infraction, but they always settled back on the bee hotel, the source of her singular obsession for the past 3 months. The threat wasn't just about a fine or a structure. It was about power, her power, and my refusal to bow to it. This was the culmination of weeks of passive-aggressive notes, veiled threats in community newsletters, and whispered campaigns among the neighbors. And now, here she was, ready to bring in the wrecking crew. But I'm not the kind of man who backs down from a bully. I learned that in the Corps. You don't win by yelling louder. You win by being smarter, more prepared, and having a bigger stick you hope you never have to use. My stick in this case was a mountain of paperwork she couldn't possibly comprehend. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch, watching her face tighten with impatience. The sledgehammer in that truck wasn't just for my bee hotel. It was a message for the whole neighborhood. Fall in line or be broken. I knew in that moment this wasn't just about bees anymore. This was war. It's always a trip, isn't it? How one person can try to ruin a good thing for everyone. If you've ever had your own HOA nightmare or dealt with a Karen who thinks the world revolves around her clipboard, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your stories. Now let me tell you how this all started. Long before the threats and the $10,000 fines, back when Oak Creek Meadows still felt like the peaceful haven my wife, Sarah, and I had been searching for. We bought the house in Oak Creek Meadows 2 years ago, after my 20 years in the Marine Corps came to an honorable end. I was a combat engineer, a glorified title for a guy who learned how to build things up, and, when necessary, take them apart with startling efficiency. After 2 decades of living out of a duffel bag in places that were mostly sand and conflict, all I wanted was a patch of green, a garage for my woodworking tools, and a quiet life. Oak Creek Meadows seemed to tick all the boxes. The houses were nice, not cookie-cutter, but harmonious, with mature oak trees lining the streets and a genuine sense of suburban tranquility. The HOA, at first glance, seemed reasonable. The rules were thick, a binder full of regulations on everything from mailbox color to the acceptable species of lawn grass. But they seemed designed to maintain property values, and I could respect that. I'm a man who appreciates order and discipline. For the first year and a half, life was exactly what we'd hoped for. I converted the spacious 2-car garage into a woodworking shop that would make a master carpenter weep. I built custom furniture for Sarah, a new dining table, bookshelves, and a beautiful 4-poster bed. Word got around, and soon I had a small but steady stream of clients, fellow veterans and locals who appreciated handcrafted quality. My business, Semper Fi Woodworks, was born. I was my own boss, working with my hands, listening to old rock and roll, with our golden retriever, Gunner, snoring on a pile of sawdust in the corner. It was perfect. The HOA was a distant hum, a quarterly fee, and an occasional newsletter. Karen was just a name on that newsletter, the HOA president, a woman I'd only seen from a distance at the community mailbox, usually in the process of scrutinizing someone's flower beds. My introduction to her reign of petty terror was indirect. A story from my neighbor Dave, a retired accountant who had dared to plant a Japanese maple that was, according to Karen, 2 feet too close to his driveway. The ensuing battle involved certified letters, threats of legal action, and a public shaming at an HOA meeting all over a sapling. Dave eventually gave in and moved the tree, but the experience left him bitter and wary. "She feeds on it," he told me over the fence one afternoon. "The rules are just the teeth. She's the shark." I filed the information away but didn't give it much thought. I followed the rules. My lawn was immaculate. My trash cans were always hidden. My fence was the approved shade of beige. I was a model resident. I was no threat. The thing that changed all that, the thing that put me directly in Karen's crosshairs, started with a phone call from my old service buddy Mike. The genesis of my war with Karen wasn't a fence or a lawn gnome. It was a box of bees. Not honeybees, the kind that come with hives and honey and the potential for swarms, but solitary native bees. The gentle, hard-working, and increasingly endangered pollinators of our local ecosystem. The idea came from my old buddy Mike, who had traded his uniform for a tweed jacket and was now an entomology professor at Northwood University. He called me one evening, his voice buzzing with the kind of excitement only a scientist can muster for insects. "Mark, you still doing that incredible woodworking of yours?" he'd asked. "I've got a project, a grant, and a problem you are uniquely qualified to solve." He explained his research. Native bee populations were plummeting, and a huge part of the problem was habitat loss. His team was studying how different microhabitats affected bee nesting and proliferation. They needed to deploy dozens of bee hotels, structures that provide nesting tubes for different species of solitary bees, across a variety of environments. The problem was the standard commercially available bee hotels were junk, poorly made, often from treated wood that was toxic to the bees, with drilled holes that were rough and splintery, leading to torn wings and infections. "They're death traps," Mike had lamented. "We need something better, something perfect." And I thought of you, the guy who could build a structurally sound bridge out of popsicle sticks and duct tape under simulated mortar fire. The project resonated with me on a deep level. It was a perfect fusion of my skills and my desire to do something constructive, something that contributed to the world instead of just occupying space in it. It was a mission. We spent weeks on the design. Mike sent me scientific papers on the preferred nesting tube diameters for Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard mason bee, and Megachile rotundata, the alfalfa leafcutter bee. We talked about wood types, settling on untreated cedar for its weather resistance and natural antimicrobial properties. I got obsessed. I used my CNC machine to drill thousands of holes with surgical precision, each one perfectly smooth. The tubes were of varying depths and diameters, catering to a whole community of different species. The final structure wasn't just a box with holes, it was a piece of architectural art. It had a pitched cedar shake roof to keep the rain off the nesting blocks, copper flashing, I hammered myself, and an intricate laser-engraved facade with a honeycomb pattern. It stood about 5 feet tall, mounted on a sturdy post, and looked like a strange, beautiful sculpture. It was a testament to precision, craftsmanship, and purpose. I installed it in my side yard, in a sunny spot near Sarah's prize-winning rose garden, a perfect foraging ground for the future residents. It was art, science, and conservation all in one. I was immensely proud of it. The first person to officially notice it, besides Sarah and Gunnar, was Karen. She was on one of her neighborhood patrols, her electric golf cart humming down the sidewalk at a funereal pace. She slowed to a stop in front of my house, her eyes narrowing. I was out weeding the garden bed nearby and gave her a friendly wave. She didn't wave back. She got out of her cart, a maneuver that involved a fair amount of shifting and grunting, and marched onto my lawn, clipboard already in hand. "What?" she began. No hello, no preamble. "Is that?" She pointed a thick finger at the bee hotel. "That's a native bee habitat," I said, trying to keep my tone light and informative. "It's part of a research project with Northwood University's entomology department." I was actually excited to explain it to her, thinking she might find it interesting. I was naive. She scribbled something on her clipboard. Unapproved structure, she muttered, the words sounding like a verdict. And it's designed to attract insects? To your yard? To my neighborhood? The "my" was heavily emphasized. It attracts solitary, non-aggressive native pollinators, I corrected gently. They're crucial for the ecosystem. They don't swarm and they don't have queens or hives to defend. They're harmless and incredibly beneficial. Karen looked from the bee hotel to me, and a flicker of something I would come to know very well crossed her face. The sheer, unadulterated joy of finding a new rule to enforce, a new person to crush under the weight of the HOA bylaws. The bylaws are very clear, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dripping with condescending authority. Section 7, paragraph B, subsection 4, no sheds, outbuildings, or other freestanding structures may be erected without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. And I am the chair of that committee. I don't recall seeing an application. She gave a smug little smile. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation. I suggest you take it down before then. We have a standard to maintain. She turned, marched back to her golf cart, and hummed away, leaving me standing in my garden, the warmth of my pride suddenly chilled. The first shot had been fired. I hadn't built a bee hotel. I had built a battleground. The first letter arrived 3 days later via certified mail. The official HOA envelope felt heavier than it should, weighted with the promise of bureaucratic headaches. Inside, on thick, creamy letterhead embossed with the Oak Creek Meadows logo, was violation notice number 00437. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak, citing the dreaded Section 7, paragraph B, subsection 4. My beautiful handcrafted bee hotel was officially designated an unauthorized outbuilding. The notice informed me I had 14 days to remedy the violation, that is, tear it down, or face an initial fine of $250, followed by escalating daily fines of $50 until compliance was achieved. It was signed with a flourish by Karen Shipman, president and chair of the Architectural Review Committee. I didn't panic. In the Marines, the first principle of dealing with any new threat is to gather intelligence. I sat down at the dining room table, the one I'd built, solid oak, a place for family and strategy, and laid out the HOA bylaws next to the violation notice. Sarah sat across from me, a worried line creasing her forehead. Maybe you should just move it to the backyard, she suggested, ever the peacemaker. Out of sight, out of her mind. That's not the point, honey, I said, running a finger over the dense text of the bylaws. And it's not her mind we have to worry about. It's her clipboard. This isn't about where the hotel is. This is about her needing to be in control. The bylaws were a labyrinth. I read them cover to cover, highlighting anything relevant. The section she quoted was real, but it was clearly intended for things like tool sheds and gazebos. There was also, however, a vague clause about lawn ornaments and another about maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the community. It was a web of subjective rules that could be interpreted any way the board, meaning Karen, saw fit. My first step was to respond formally, creating a paper trail. I typed up a letter, polite but firm. I explained again the purpose of the structure. I attached a letter from Professor Mike on official Northwood University letterhead, detailing the scope of the research project, its scientific importance, and my role as a citizen scientist volunteer. I included color photographs of the bee hotel, pointing out its artistic design and high-quality construction. I argued that it was not a shed or outbuilding, but fell into a category more akin to a birdhouse or a piece of garden sculpture, neither of which required ARC approval according to their own rules. I sent my response, complete with its attachments, via certified mail, return receipt requested. It was overkill, but I knew I was dealing with someone who would claim a letter was lost in the mail if it suited her. While I waited for the inevitable counterattack, Karen launched a new offensive on the ground. She began her whisper campaign. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down, a sweet old lady who always complimented Sarah's roses, suddenly started crossing the street to avoid our house. Young mothers from the cul-de-sac would hurry their children past my yard, casting anxious glances at the bee hotel as if it were a radioactive waste dump. The story, as pieced together from Dave, my fence line informant, was that Karen was telling everyone I had installed an illegal apiary and that swarms of aggressive killer bees were about to descend upon the neighborhood, endangering pets and children. It was absurd. Solitary bees, by definition, do not swarm. Most of them are so docile you can literally pet them as they work. But fear is a more powerful motivator than fact, especially when wielded by a determined demagogue. I started documenting everything. I bought a small notebook and dedicated it to the Karen Project. I noted the date and time of her initial threat. I logged when I received the violation and when I sent my response. I started taking my phone with me whenever I was in the front yard, ready to record any new confrontations. This methodical process of documentation was second nature to me. In the core, your reports had to be flawless, because lives could depend on it. Here, my financial life and my peace of mind were on the line. The 14-day deadline passed. A second letter arrived. The fine had been levied, $250. My formal response was dismissed in a single, galling sentence. The committee has reviewed your correspondence and found that it does not alter the nature of the violation. The letter was a form template, with my name and the violation details filled in. They hadn't even bothered with a personalized rebuttal. They hadn't read my letter. They had simply waited for the clock to run out so they could start taking my money. That's when the anger, a cold, familiar presence, began to solidify and to resolve. This was no longer a disagreement, it was an attack. And I was not going to be a passive victim. I had tried reason, I had tried procedure. Now it was time to bring in bigger guns. I picked up the phone and called Professor Mike. "Mike," I said, my voice tight, "we have a problem. It's time for the university to get involved." The phone call with Mike was a turning point. I laid out the situation for him in precise chronological detail. Karen's initial confrontation, the official violation notice, my formal response with his letter attached, and the subsequent fine and dismissal of my appeal. I could almost hear the academic tweed of his jacket rustling in indignation over the phone. She dismissed a university-sanctioned research project as an unauthorized outbuilding, he sputtered, and started a panic about killer bees. "Mark, this is not just absurd, it's potentially tortious interference with our work." He used the word tortious like a weapon he was unsheathing for the first time in years. "The grant for this project is from the National Science Foundation. We have reporting requirements. We have a timeline. This woman isn't just being a neighborhood tyrant. She's actively obstructing scientific progress." That was the angle I needed. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the university's fight. It was science's fight. "What's our next move, Professor?" I asked, slipping back into a familiar subordinate role, but this time as part of an intellectual platoon. "I'm escalating this," Mike said, his voice firming up. "I'm taking it straight to the Dean of Sciences and the Office of General Counsel. They have lawyers for exactly this kind of thing. People who eat HOA presidents for breakfast." He paused. "In the meantime, Mark, and this is critical, do not engage with her. Do not argue. Do not pay the fine. Just keep documenting. Every conversation, every letter, every dirty look. Build your case file. You were a master at after-action reports. Treat this the same way." The next day I got a call from a man named Alan Davies, an associate counsel for Northwood University. His voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of panic. It was the kind of voice you wanted to hear when you were in a foxhole and things were getting complicated. He'd already been briefed by Mike and had reviewed the documents I'd scanned and emailed over. "Mr. Thorne," he began, "first, thank you for your participation in this vital research. The university values its community partners, and we don't take it lightly when their contributions are threatened." He then walked me through the legal landscape. While an HOA has broad powers, those powers are not absolute. He mentioned things like public interest, academic freedom, and the potential for a lawsuit if the HOA's actions cause material harm to the university's multi-year, grant-funded research. "We're going to start with a letter," he said. "Polite, professional, but written on the kind of letterhead that makes people sit up and take notice. We will explain the legal and scientific basis for the project's protection. We will request that the HOA immediately cease and desist all enforcement actions against you related to the bee habitat, rescind all fines, and issue a formal retraction of the violation notice." He added with a hint of dry humor, We find that a letter from a university legal department is often more persuasive than one from a resident, no matter how well argued. A week later, a copy of that letter arrived in my mailbox, along with a note from Davies. It was a thing of beauty. 3 pages of single-spaced, tightly reasoned legal prose, citing state and federal statutes regarding environmental research, referencing the NSF grant by its official number, and politely but unmistakably threatening to explore all available legal remedies should the HOA continue its unwarranted interference. The letter was addressed directly to Karen Shipman in the HOA Board of Directors. I imagined it landing in the community clubhouse mailbox like a guided missile. For a few days, there was a beautiful, blissful silence. The daily fines stopped appearing in my online HOA portal. The passive-aggressive newsletters made no mention of unapproved structures. I even got a hesitant wave from Mrs. Henderson across the street. I allowed myself a sliver of hope that reason, or at least the fear of a lawsuit, had prevailed. But I had underestimated the sheer, diamond-hard arrogance of Karen Shipman. Her ego was a force of nature, and it had just been challenged by a bigger, more powerful entity. A rational person would have backed down, consulted their own lawyer, and cut their losses. Karen was not a rational person. Her response was to declare total war. A new flyer appeared, taped to every mailbox and lamppost in Oak Creek Meadows. It was printed on lurid yellow paper. At the top, in a font usually reserved for horror movie posters, it screamed, "Emergency Community Meeting. Is your family safe?" Below the headline was a grainy, pixelated stock photo, not of a solitary bee, but of an angry hornet, its stinger prominently displayed. The text was a masterwork of fear-mongering. It spoke of unvetted scientific experiments, uncontrolled insect breeding, and potential threats to property values and personal safety. It announced a special meeting to be held at the community clubhouse in 1 week's time, for the sole purpose of a binding vote on the forced removal of the hazardous structure at 112 Arbor Lane. My address. She had put my family's home on a wanted poster. Sarah was furious. "She's putting a target on our backs, Mark. This has gone too far." "I know," I said, my voice a low growl. I held up the yellow flyer. "This isn't a legal document. This is a propaganda leaflet. And you know what you do with propaganda? You counter it with intelligence." I called Alan Davies. "She's calling a public meeting to vote on removing it," I told him. "She's trying to use mob rule to circumvent your legal letter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Davies said, his voice imbued with a newfound coldness, "Excellent, a public meeting. That's a very public place to be proven wrong." He continued, "Mr. Thorne, she just handed us the perfect venue. But we can't just rely on the law. We need to win over the residents. Does the HOA make its budget and meeting minutes public?" "They have to by state law," I replied. "They're usually posted on the community website, buried under a dozen menus." "Find them," Davies instructed. "Find the last 2 years of budgets, expenditures, and all the meeting minutes. Read every line. Bullies like this, they're never just bullies. They're usually hiding something else. Financial mismanagement, self-dealing, it's a common pattern. Her power feels absolute, so she gets sloppy. Look for the sloppiness." The hunt was on. Karen thought she was arranging a public execution. She had no idea she was actually building her own gallows. The emergency meeting was Karen's declaration of war, and I knew I couldn't just walk in with a lawyer and a professor and expect to win. This was a battle for the hearts and minds of my neighbors, people who were mostly good, but had been cowed by Karen's reign or spooked by her propaganda. I had to fight back on 2 fronts, the legal and the personal. While Alan Davies prepared the legal ordinance, my mission was to gather battlefield intelligence. Following his advice, I dove headfirst into the murky depths of the Oak Creek Meadows HOA website. It was, as I suspected, a nightmare of poor design, a digital labyrinth intended to obscure rather than inform. But I had navigated far more complex systems. I found the repository of documents, a collection of poorly scanned PDFs, and began the painstaking process of downloading and organizing 2 years' worth of HOA finances, budgets, expense reports, monthly P&Ls, and meeting minutes. It was a mountain of data. Sarah, who had a background in bookkeeping before the kids, saw the grim look on my face and pulled up a chair. "Okay, soldier," she said. "What's the mission?" We turned our dining room table into a command center. We printed everything, spreading the papers out, armed with highlighters and legal pads. For 2 nights, we did nothing but read, cross-reference, and connect the dots. At first, it all looked depressingly normal. Line items for landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, administrative fees. But as Davies predicted, the sloppiness started to show. The first red flag was the community events budget. It was surprisingly large, over $15,000 a year for a neighborhood of our size. The minutes from the meetings mentioned a spring fling, a 4th of July BBQ, and a holiday gala. But when I looked at the corresponding expense reports, the details were vague. Catering, $4,500. Entertainment, $2,000. The vendor names were what caught my eye. Auntie K's Catering. Prestige Party Planners. A quick search online revealed Auntie K's Catering was an unregistered business with a single glowing review from a K, Shipman. The business address was a P.O. box. Prestige Party Planners was run by Karen's sister-in-law. It was circumstantial, but it stank of cronyism. The real bombshell was in the landscaping budget. It was massive, nearly a third of the HOA's entire annual expenditure. The line items were for general maintenance, seasonal planting, and tree trimming. The contractor was a company called Green Pastures Landscaping. For months, the invoices were a steady, predictable amount. Then about 8 months ago, they spiked. A single invoice for special project retaining wall and fountain installation for $22,000. I remembered that. Karen had announced in a newsletter that the board had approved a beautiful new water feature for the community entrance. But when I drove to the entrance, there was no new fountain. The retaining wall was the same old brick it had always been. It didn't make sense. Where did that $22,000 go? I pulled up the county property records website. I typed in Karen Shipman's address. The site had recent satellite photos. I zoomed in on her backyard, and there it was. A brand new multi-tiered stone retaining wall, an elaborate slate patio, and nestled in the center, a gurgling 3-tiered stone fountain. It was a perfect match for the special project description. She hadn't built a community water feature. She had used HOA funds to build her own private resort, disguising the invoice to get it past the treasurer, who was an elderly man known to sign whatever Karen put in front of him. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Sarah whispered, looking over my shoulder at the satellite image on the screen, then at the invoice on the table. "She's not just a bully, she's a thief." I felt a cold, clean surge of adrenaline. This was the kill shot. This changed everything. My B hotel was just the pretext. The real story was a corrupt HOA president embezzling funds from her neighbors. Karen's crusade against me wasn't just about power, it was a diversion. By making me the villain, she kept everyone's eyes off her own hands in the cookie jar. While I was digging through the paper trail, I also launched a quiet counterinsurgency in the neighborhood. I baked 24 of Sarah's famous chocolate chip cookies and went for a walk. I didn't go to the houses of Karen's known allies. I went to the quiet ones, the people who kept to themselves. I started with Mrs. Henderson. I knocked on her door. She opened it a crack, looking nervous. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, holding out the plate of cookies. "My wife and I were baking and made too many. I also wanted to apologize if my garden project has caused you any concern. There's been a lot of misinformation, and I wanted to give you this." I handed her a 1-page fact sheet I'd printed up. It was from the university with pictures, explaining what solitary bees were, how they lived, and how they posed zero threat. I didn't argue. I didn't mention Karen. I just gave her the facts and a warm cookie. I did this with a dozen other houses. The response was a mix of caution and curiosity, but I was planting seeds of doubt about Karen's narrative. My most important visit was to Bill, a retired Army first sergeant who lived 3 streets over. He was a quiet man who spent most of his days polishing his classic Ford Mustang. A year ago, he'd had a run-in with Karen over the height of his flagpole. He had wanted to fly a large garrison flag on special occasions, but Karen had shot him down, citing a rule about flagpole dimensions with military-like ferocity. He'd been simmering ever since. I found him in his garage. I told him everything. the B hotel, the research, the threats, the meeting. Then I told him what I'd found in the budget. He listened intently, his jaw tightening. When I finished, he wiped a greasy hand on a rag and looked me dead in the eye. "Son," he said, his voice a low gravel, "you're a Marine. I'm Army. But tonight, we're on the same side. What time's the meeting?" The pieces were in place. The lawyer, the professor, the evidence of corruption, and a small but growing coalition of disgruntled neighbors. Karen thought she was orchestrating a public shaming. She had no idea she was the one walking into the ambush. The night of the emergency meeting, the air in the Oak Creek Meadows clubhouse was thick with a mixture of cheap air freshener and palpable tension. The room was designed for benign activities like potlucks and book clubs, with its flimsy folding chairs and faded inspirational posters. But tonight it felt like a courtroom. Nearly 100 residents had turned out, a testament to the effectiveness of Karen's fear-mongering flyer. They were a mix of worried parents, curious retirees, and what I privately termed Karen's crows, a small flock of her loyalists who sat in the front row, nodding at her every word. I arrived early with my team. There was me, in a simple but well-pressed polo shirt and slacks, looking more like a suburban dad than a veteran ready for battle. Beside me was Sarah, her presence a silent, solid pillar of support. Then there was my platoon, Professor Mike, looking distinguished and slightly out of place in his tweed jacket, carrying a briefcase full of scientific literature, and Alan Davies, the university lawyer, in a perfectly tailored suit that radiated quiet competence. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a projector. We set up in the back, a strategic position that allowed us to observe the entire room. I saw Bill, the Army sergeant, sitting near the side exit, giving me a subtle, affirmative nod. I saw Mrs. Henderson, who gave me a small, nervous smile. My cookie diplomacy had at least neutralized some of the hostility. Karen stood at a lectern at the front of the room, basking in the attention. She was wearing a vibrant purple pantsuit, the kind of outfit that screams, "I am in charge here." She beamed at the crowd, her co-president, a mousy man named Gerald, hovering beside her like a court eunuch. She banged a gavel with theatrical flair. "This emergency meeting of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association is now in session," she boomed. Her opening statement was a 15-minute diatribe. She painted herself as the tireless defender of the community, the lone sentinel on the wall protecting them from the dangers of unapproved, hazardous installations. She used loaded words like infestation, liability, and flagrant disregard for our shared values. She never used my name, only referring to the resident at 112 Arbor Lane, as if I were a case number, not a neighbor. "This isn't about one structure," she declared, her voice rising with synthetic passion. "It's about precedent. If we allow one resident to ignore the rules, to build whatever they want, to introduce potential pests into our neighborhood, where does it end? Anarchy, that's where it ends. Today we take a stand for order, for safety, and for the property values we have all worked so hard to protect." She was good, I had to give her that. She knew how to play on people's fears. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Her crows cawed their approval. She finished her speech, and then, with a smug smile, said, "The floor is now open for comments from the community before we proceed to the vote. The board recognizes that the resident in question is present, and in the interest of fairness, will allow him 5 minutes to speak." 5 minutes. She was trying to frame me, to limit my response, to make me seem like a defendant, pleading for mercy. That was her first mistake. I walked to the front of the room, not to the lectern, but to the center of the open space, putting myself on the same level as my neighbors. I didn't have any notes. I didn't need them. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to Karen's screeching. "My name is Mark Thorne, and I'm the resident at 112 Arbor Lane. I'm a retired Marine, a husband, a father, and your neighbor. And I'm not here to plead. I'm here to present the facts." I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. The structure on my property is not a hazardous installation. It's a solitary bee habitat, part of a registered, grant-funded research project with Northwood University to study and support our native pollinators, which are essential for a healthy environment. The bees are harmless. They don't swarm. They don't sting unless you physically crush them. They are, quite literally, some of the most beneficial and gentle insects in our ecosystem. Professor Mike stood up. "If I may," he said, his academic authority filling the room. Karen looked flustered, not having planned for reinforcements. "I'm Professor Michael Vance, head of the entomology department at Northwood. I'd be happy to answer any scientific questions you may have about these fascinating and vital creatures." A few hands went up, not with angry questions, but with curious ones. Mike patiently and clearly debunked the myths Karen had spread, explaining the difference between honeybees, wasps, and the solitary bees my hotel was built for. He turned Karen's weapon of fear into a fascinating impromptu science lesson. The mood in the room began to shift, from anxiety to interest. I saw Karen whispering furiously to Gerald. Her narrative was slipping. I took back the floor. This was never about safety. I tried to explain this to Ms. Shipman from the beginning. I provided her with documentation from the university. In response, I received fines, threats, and my family's home was plastered on a flyer designed to make you afraid of us. Now it was time for the second phase of the attack, which brings me to the real reason we're all here tonight. It's not about my bee hotel. It's about rules, accountability, and how our money, your money, is being spent. Alan Davies stepped forward and smoothly connected his laptop to the projector. The screen behind Karen flickered to life. The first image was the Oak Creek Meadows logo. "My name is Alan Davies, Associate Counsel for Northwood University," he said, "but tonight I'm here as a private citizen assisting Mr. Thorne in a review of public HOA documents." Karen's face went pale. "This is out of order. This is not on the agenda," she sputtered. "I believe an inquiry into the board's fiscal responsibility is always in order, Miss Shipman," Davies said coolly, "especially when the board is proposing to spend community funds to demolish a research project it has been legally advised not to touch." He clicked to the next slide. It was the invoice from Auntie Kay's Catering for $4,500. "Can anyone here tell me about the last 4th of July BBQ?" Davies asked the crowd. A man in the back grumbled. "What BBQ? It was canceled because of budgetary concerns." Davies nodded. "Interesting, because the HOA paid over $4,000 to a catering company for that canceled event. A company, by the way, that appears to be owned by a close relative of Miss Shipman." A gasp went through the room. The crows in the front row looked at each other, confused. Davies didn't wait. Click. The next slide showed the $22,000 invoice for the special project, retaining wall and fountain installation. Click. The next slide was the satellite image of Karen's backyard, with a big red circle around her lavish new patio and fountain. "As you can see," Davies said, his voice like ice, "the beautiful community water feature was indeed installed. It's right behind Miss Shipman's house." The room erupted. The mousy treasurer, Gerald, looked like he was about to faint. People were shouting, pointing at Karen. "Thief!" someone yelled. "Is this true?" another demanded. Karen stood frozen at the lectern, her face a mask of shock and fury. She had walked into a public meeting expecting to be a conquering hero, and instead she had been led into a perfectly executed ambush. The trap had been sprung. The chaos that followed the revelation of the fountain was a sight to behold. The carefully constructed facade of Karen's authority crumbled in a matter of seconds. The folding chairs scraped against the linoleum as people stood up, shouting questions, demanding answers. The crows in the front row were no longer nodding in sycophantic agreement. They were staring at Karen with expressions of betrayal, the dawning realization that their loyalty had been to a con artist. Karen, for her part, was floundering. Her usual weapons, the gavel, the condescending tone, the citation of bylaws were useless against the raw, undeniable evidence projected on the screen behind her. That's a misrepresentation," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the satellite photo of her backyard oasis. "That was a prototype, to test the design before we installed the real one for the community." The lie was so audacious, so pathetic, that it was met with a wave of derisive laughter. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a current of righteous anger and dark humor. "A $22,000 prototype in your backyard, Karen?" a voice called out. "Must be nice." Bill, the army sergeant, stood up. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the unmistakable ring of command that cut through the chatter. "I think we've heard enough," he said, his eyes fixed on Karen. "For a year, you've been fining people for the color of their mailboxes and the height of their flagpoles. You've been telling us it's all about the rules and the standards. But it seems the rules don't apply to you, do they, Karen? It seems while you were measuring our grass, you were robbing us blind." He turned to the rest of the room. "I think the agenda for this meeting has changed. The question is no longer about Mr. Thorne's B project. The question is about the fitness of this board to lead." Alan Davies, ever the calm strategist, stepped forward again. "Under the Oak Creek Meadows bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph C, a vote of no confidence in any board member can be called by a petition of 25% of the homeowners present at a general meeting. A motion from the floor is required." Before he had even finished the sentence, 3 people were on their feet. "I so move!" shouted Dave, my neighbor, the one who had been terrorized over his Japanese maple. He looked liberated, a man breathing free air for the first time in years. "Seconded!" yelled a woman from the back who I knew had been fined for having a political sign in her yard a day too long. "All in favor of holding a vote of no confidence in President Karen Shipman?" Bill called out, taking charge. A forest of hands shot up. It was nearly unanimous. Even some of her crows, seeing which way the wind was blowing, reluctantly raised their hands. Karen's face was a mottled mess of red and white. She looked at Gerald, the treasurer, for support, but he was staring at his shoes, looking as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. She was alone. The vote itself was a formality, a public execution by paper ballot. Alan Davies and Sarah helped distribute slips of paper. As people wrote down their yes or no, the room was filled with a low, determined buzz. It was the sound of a community taking back its power. While the votes were being counted by Bill and 2 other trusted residents, I took a moment. I looked at the B Hotel, still projected on the screen in a slide I had prepared. It was a beautiful thing, a small monument to reason and nature. It had started as a simple project, a way to do some good. It had become a lightning rod, drawing all the poison in the community to one spot. And now it was about to become a symbol of victory. Bill stood up to announce the results. He held the tallied sheet in his hand. "The motion carries," he announced, his voice ringing with satisfaction. "By a vote of 87-4, the community has voted no confidence in Karen Shipman as president of the HOA. The room exploded in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a genuine, cathartic roar of approval. People were cheering, hugging, shaking hands. Mrs. Henderson was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, a huge smile on her face. Karen stood there, utterly defeated. The purple pantsuit that had seemed so powerful an hour ago now just looked garish and sad. She grabbed her purse, pushed past a stunned Gerald without a word, and stormed out of the clubhouse into the night, the sound of the community's celebration chasing her out the door. The aftermath was swift. Gerald, the treasurer, resigned on the spot via a mumbled statement to Bill. The other 2 board members, Karen's cronies, quickly followed suit. In the power vacuum, the community turned to new leadership. Bill was nominated and elected as the interim president by acclamation. Dave, the maple tree victim, was made treasurer, a role he accepted with a grim determination to audit every last receipt. And in a move that brought me a deep sense of satisfaction, the community voted to make me the new head of the Architectural Review Committee. My first official act, proposed by a motion from the floor and passed unanimously, was to formally approve the installation of the B Hotel at 112 Arbor Lane and to declare it a protected community environmental project. All fines against me were voided, and the board was instructed to issue a formal, public apology. As we packed up the projector, Alan Davies clapped me on the shoulder. "You know," he said with a wry smile, "for a guy who just wanted to build a box for some bees, you just staged a pretty effective coup." I looked around the room, at my neighbors who were now talking and laughing, no longer afraid. "I didn't do it alone," I said, and I hadn't. Karen's own greed and arrogance had been my greatest weapon. She had built her own trap, and I had simply let her walk into it. The week following the meeting was one of dramatic and satisfying change for Oak Creek Meadows. It felt like a country that had just overthrown a dictator. There was an air of newfound freedom and cooperation. Bill, as interim president, proved to be the leader we needed. Fair, no nonsense, and transparent. His first act was to hire a forensic accountant to go through the last 5 years of the HOA's books. The preliminary findings were even worse than we had imagined. The fountain was just the tip of the iceberg. Karen had been using the HOA's credit card for personal expenses, groceries, gas, even a weekend spy trip she disguised as board development training. She had a slush fund of petty cash she used to reward her friends and punish her enemies. The total amount of embezzled and misused funds was estimated to be north of $50,000. The new board, with Dave at the financial helm, immediately turned all the evidence over to the local police department. A criminal investigation was launched. Karen, who had seemingly vanished after the meeting, was suddenly very much on the police's radar. My B Hotel, the catalyst for the entire revolution, became an unlikely neighborhood celebrity. People who had once hurried past my yard now stopped to look at it, asking me questions with genuine interest. I ended up giving several impromptu tours, explaining the different nesting tubes and pointing out the first few fuzzy inhabitants who were just beginning to explore their new home. The kids in the neighborhood, no longer afraid of killer bees, were fascinated. With Professor Mike's guidance, I hosted a pollinator day in my front yard. We set up a microscope connected to a laptop to show them bee larvae in the observation tubes, and Mike gave a presentation about the importance of pollinators. It was a huge success. The new HOA board not only endorsed the event, but paid for the lemonade and cookies, with a proper receipt from a legitimate local bakery. The apology I had been promised arrived in the form of an official letter, hand-delivered by Bill. It was formal, sincere, and deeply gratifying to read. It was also posted on the community website, replacing the old threatening newsletters. But the most symbolic moment of change came a few weeks later. The new Architectural Review Committee, which I now chaired, held its first meeting. Our first proposal, submitted by Dave, was to completely overhaul the ARC guidelines. We didn't eliminate the rules, but we rewrote them with a focus on clarity, reason, and flexibility. We introduced a presumption of approval for projects that were well-conceived and didn't negatively impact neighbors. We streamlined the application process. Our goal was to make the ARC a resource for homeowners, not a punitive body. Our first application under the new system was from Bill. He wanted to install a new 25-foot flagpole in his yard so he could properly fly the garrison flag on national holidays. It was taller than the old rules allowed. I looked at his application, which was filled out perfectly. I looked at my fellow committee members, all new faces, all people who had felt the sting of the old regime. All in favor of approving Sergeant Major Bill's flagpole? I asked. Every hand went up. The motion passed unanimously. It was a small thing, a flagpole, but it was everything. It was about restoring dignity and respect, about replacing petty tyranny with common sense. About a month after the fateful meeting, the local news, which had been following the police investigation, ran a story. They'd been tipped off by someone, I suspect Alan Davies, about the human interest angle. The headline read, HOA President ousted and investigated for embezzlement after harassing veteran over bee research project. The story featured an interview with a flustered Karen, tracked down by a persistent reporter, denying everything. But they juxtaposed her denials with photos of the evidence. The invoices, the satellite image of her backyard, and a shot of my B Hotel, now buzzing with life. Her public downfall was complete. I never saw Karen in the neighborhood again. The for sale sign went up on her lawn a week after the news story aired. It sold quickly. The new owners are a young family who, upon learning the history of the house, came over to introduce themselves and thank me. The wife is an avid gardener, and she was thrilled about the Bee Hotel and its positive impact on her future flower beds. Life in Oak Creek Meadows is different now. It's quieter, but in a good way. The fear is gone. Neighbors talk to each other more. There's a sense of shared ownership, of a community that stood up for itself and won. My woodworking business is booming, thanks in part to the local fame. And the Bee Hotel, it's thriving. Professor Mike's research team has been out twice to collect data, and they are ecstatic. The population density and species diversity in my hotel are among the highest in their entire study. They've even discovered a rare species of leafcutter bee that hadn't been documented in our county for 30 years. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I'll grab a beer and a chair and just sit in my yard watching the bees. They are diligent, focused, and completely oblivious to the drama they caused. They just go about their business, each one doing its small part, building something, creating life. They remind me of what a community should be. They remind me that sometimes the most important battles are fought in your own front yard, and that no bully, no matter how loud or powerful they seem, can stand against a person who is calm, prepared, and fighting for something they believe in. Even if that something is just a box full of bees. The seasons turned, and the Bee Hotel became a fixture, a silent testament to the drama it had ignited. Spring saw it bustling with activity as new generations of mason bees emerged, their metallic blue bodies glinting in the sun. Summer brought the leafcutter bees, who meticulously snipped perfect circles from Sarah's rose bushes to build their nursery cells, a minor tax we were happy to pay for their pollination services. The hotel was no longer a point of contention, but a point of pride, a conversation starter. The new family who bought Karen's house even installed a smaller version in their own yard after their kids became fascinated with my bee castle. The ripple effects of that one chaotic meeting continued to spread in the most positive ways. The forensic audit concluded that Karen had misappropriated nearly $70,000 over her 4-year tenure as president. The district attorney's office, armed with an airtight case built on Dave's meticulous accounting and the evidence we had gathered, charged her with felony embezzlement. Her trial was a brief, pathetic affair. Faced with a mountain of evidence, she took a plea deal. The sentence included restitution, probation, and community service. In a moment of what I can only describe as cosmic irony, a judge, unaware of the backstory, sentenced her to 200 hours of community service with the County Parks Department, specifically with the team responsible for maintaining public gardens and natural habitats. I sometimes imagined her, in a bright orange vest, weeding a pollinator garden, surrounded by the very creatures she had once declared a menace. The Oak Creek Meadows, HOA, was transformed. Under Bill's steady leadership, the board became a model of community governance. Meetings were open, finances were transparent, and decisions were made collaboratively. The Karen's Crows contingent had either seen the light or moved away, replaced by residents who were engaged and constructive. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a spirit of live and let live, grounded in mutual respect. We even amended the bylaws to include a new section encouraging and protecting resident-led environmental projects. From pollinator gardens to rainwater harvesting systems, we went from being a neighborhood that punished initiative to one that celebrated it. My role as head of the Architectural Review Committee was far less dramatic than its inception. Mostly, it involved approving new paint colors and fence repairs. But it was important work. Every quick, reasonable approval was a small act of rebellion against the old regime. It was a quiet way of saying, "We trust you. We are neighbors, not adversaries." The most significant change, however, was in me. The fight had reawakened a part of myself that had been dormant since I left the Corps. The part that plans, strategizes, and stands firm against injustice. I had thought my quiet life meant a passive life, but I learned that protecting peace sometimes requires you to go to war. It also opened up a new path I never expected. Professor Mike was so impressed with the community engagement and the success of the Bee Hotel that he asked me to become a formal consultant for his program. My role was to help other citizen scientists navigate the often tricky landscape of local ordinances and community relations. I helped design a community integration kit that included fact sheets, sample letters to HOAs, and strategies for public outreach. I even gave a guest lecture to one of his graduate seminars on applied entomology and public persuasion. It turned out my experience was a valuable, if unconventional, data point. One afternoon, Sarah and I were sitting on our porch, watching the sunset. The light caught the copper flashing on the Bee Hotel, making it glow. It was peaceful. The only sound was the distant laughter of kids playing down the street and the gentle hum of our resident bees returning home for the evening. "You know," Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder, "it's funny. That thing," she nodded towards the hotel, "caused us so much stress. I was so scared she was going to ruin this for us. She tried, I said, putting my arm around her. But she underestimated the bees. She underestimated you, Mark, Sarah corrected me softly. She picked a fight with a Marine who builds things. What did she think was going to happen? We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes after a storm has passed and you know you're safe. Gunner, our old retriever, trotted over and laid his head in my lap, sighing contentedly. The war was over. We had won. The victory wasn't just in seeing Karen get her comeuppance, satisfying as that was. The real victory was in the community we had forged in the process. It was in the sound of laughter replacing the whispers of fear. It was in the sight of Bill's flag flying proudly against the blue sky. It was in the knowledge that a small act of creation, a home for tiny, forgotten creatures, had been enough to bring down a tyrant and build a better world, right here on our little patch of green. The fight had been about one man's bee hotel, but the victory belonged to everyone. And as the last bee tucked itself into its chamber for the night, I knew deep in my bones that we had built something that would last.